Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel according to Matthew in chapter 6, starting with the 19th verse. And it goes like this. Stop collecting treasures for your own benefit on earth, where moth and rust eat them and where thieves break in and steal them. Instead, collect treasures for yourself in heaven, where moth and rust don't eat them and where thieves don't break in and steal them. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. Therefore, if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how terrible that darkness will be. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be loyal to the one and have contempt for the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Will you join me in prayer? God, we come to this place with our hearts and our minds full of things of the world, full of things of our lives, full of things that we have planned to do after we leave this place. And we ask for today and for this time that you pause those things in our hearts, that you quiet those words in our minds, that you help us to be fully present to you, to what you have for us to hear this morning. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our God. Amen. So I've written like 4 sermons this week. So we're going to see what comes out of my mouth. One of the reasons I've written so many sermons this week is because I think of all the sermons I have ever heard people talk about in my entire life. The one that Judas Full-Bikestaff gave on this passage like 30 years ago, I've heard come up at this church more times than I think anything else that I've ever heard anybody preach ever. So there's a little bit of like legacy here going on. And I would like to just say ditto and sit down because from what I've heard of it, it was an excellent and meaningful and important sermon to preach. But I want to take a slightly different focus this morning. I was thinking about this presentation I went to when I was in seminary. They had brought in a guy from England who was an astrophysicist, which is, you might think, a weird thing for a seminary to do. But he was an astrophysicist who talked about the role of science and theology. Like, how do we deal with science and God? How are they related together? That was his study, his work. And he was talking about in this presentation that science has figured out, physics has figured out up until the last like negative 0.01035 seconds, trilliseconds of the Big Bang, right? They've gotten to within trilliseconds of figuring out how the Big Bang works, but they can't get it. They can't figure out what the leap is from the Big Bang, right, to the actual act of it happening. Which immediately every pastor in the room went, well, that's God, right? If you can't figure it out, it's God. If science can't figure it out, that's where God is. And we were feeling really smug about ourselves. And he went to the next slide, which said, it had a big picture, and it said, this is not where God is, in big red letters. It had an arrow pointing to the space between whatever was before and creation happening. And what he went on to say was that we have created, or what we tend to do as humans is create what he called the God of the gap. That whenever we feel like we can't figure out what's happening in the world, or we can't figure out something, we put God there. So I don't know what's going on in this particular situation, it must be God. Or I don't understand physics, I'm a physicist and I can't understand how this works. So the little gap between what I can figure out with my brain and the other thing that I want to figure out, that must be God. The gap between my understanding and my control over my life and what is actually happening in my life must be God. Because what we tend to do is shove God in all of the gaps in our lives where we don't quite know what's going on. or we don't quite have control over the situation, or something doesn't happen the way that we thought it should. And so we relegate God to the gaps. We put God in these earthen vessels. We store God up for when we need to pull God out. We put God into containers that say, break in case of emergency. We put God in these places where we can control God, where we can understand what God is doing. And Jesus in this passage is warning his followers about this temptation. The temptation that we have to store things up in earthen vessels. We do it with our money. We do it with our relationships. We do it with the risks of life. We do it with our politics. We do it with everything. We store up our trust in earthen vessels, which Jesus reminds his followers are moth-eaten and prone to rust. The problem is when you store up your trust, you store up your strength, you store up all of these things in these earthen vessels, they will break. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't know what's going to cause it to happen, but if it's an earthen thing, if it's part of this world, then it is subject to the same corruption as everything else in this world. It will rot. We put our trust in these things. We shove God into these things because it's easier for us to handle it and control it. It's easier for us to get our arms around it. And the biggest way that we do that is that we hedge our bets. And so what we tend to do with God is we put a little bit of God here, but we also put our trust in other things just in case God doesn't come through. And so we find ourselves torn constantly between our faith and the other things that we do in order, just in case God doesn't come through for us. We are unwilling to risk putting our whole selves into the hands of God. Now, there are some things that you should do. I want you to hear me say out loud, you should have a 401k. Yes, Liz, I have a 401k. Nod with me. I have a retirement plan. Yes, right? You should have medical care. You should go to the doctor, right? Like, I'm not saying, like, putting our trust in God means that we don't, like, do things to take care of ourselves. But we constantly have to balance how much of ourselves we are willing to risk for God. How much of our lives are we willing to put on the line for God? How much of our lives are we willing to trust God with? Now, I will admit that when I left seminary, one of my friends said she was going into homeless ministry, right? Which is a noble thing to do. It's a good thing. Homeless ministry is really important. But you know what she did? You know how she went into homeless ministry? She didn't join a 501c3. She did not like walk down to 5th Street and hey, say, do you need a minister? Because I'm available. She bought a tent and moved out on the sidewalk. And I looked at her and I said, Rebecca, you're living in a tent. You're living in a tent. And she turned to me and she said, if God calls me to homeless ministry, then God calls me to be with the homeless. God called me to be with them in their walk. God didn't call me to go home to my comfortable apartment and put my microwave dinner in and watch TV. And I said, but Rebecca, what about your 401k? And she said, God will take care of that. And I, to this day, still think she's crazy. But you know what she's doing? Ministering to the homeless. She has set up a program that transitions people from living on the street into housing. And you know why she does it? Because the people on the street put their trust in her, because she did not put her trust in earthen vessels, but in God. We are unwilling to risk for God. We spend more of our time putting our energy and our faith into things that will fall apart one day than we do asking questions about what God is calling us to do and to be. In my years of ministry, I was going to put a number on it, but I decided against it. I have had more meetings about tablecloths than I have about mission. I have had more meetings about setting up tables in the fellowship hall than I have about feeding the homeless. And all of that is hedging our bets with God. All of that is saying that if we just do things in the right way and in the right order, then we will be okay. God will bless us. And folks, that is exactly the kind of thing God is warning us against. We need a place. I am thankful for a place from which to do mission and ministry. But I wonder if we don't need to ask ourselves if we've created a world in which we are unwilling to risk ourselves for God. What have we put off limits? What have we stored in vessels that will break? Where have we chosen in our lives to put God? And when God calls us to do something bold and brave, when God calls us to act on our faith in a way that may cost us something, are we willing to do that? I don't know that for me the answer is always yes. And that's okay. Every day we're not going to be in that place. That's okay. But when the roll gets called up yonder, when Jesus calls me to and asks me to account for the things I did in my life, I don't want to say, well, look at all the cool vessels I've stored up. I want to be able to say to God that when God called me to act, that when God called me to put my trust fully in God, that I was able and ready and willing to do that. And so I ask you to consider, are you hedging your bets? Are you hedging your bets with God? Are you afraid to do what you need to do because God has called you to do that thing because it might cost you something? Are you waiting for a day when you may actually need to use all of the things you have stored up? Because, family of God, that day is today. If you have got things stored up that God has called you to use, today is the day to do that. God is asking you to smash open the vessels. God is saying, now is the time to break glass in case of emergency. Where are we willing to put ourselves? And in whom have we placed our trust? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.